Good morning, everybody. First, please allow me to say a heartily welcome to everybody who have come here this morning. We appreciate very much that you are joining us for the third research conference, Making Transparency Possible. Welcome.
This is actually a research project that brings together scholars from various fields like law, economics, and from journalism. But we also work closely with civil society organizations, such as Publish What You Pay in Norway, and all the members of Publish What You Pay in Norway. Today, we will have 2 keynotes in the morning. There will be a book launch, and then all of you are invited to the lunch, which will be served outside here. After lunch, we'll continue with panels and more keynotes, and there will also be parallel sessions on the 3rd floor, so you need to go upstairs to enjoy those.
There's also the small housekeeping issue. The toilets are right outside the door to your left, and we try to use the breaks so that we do not disturb the who's ever on the scene.
To introduce the first keynote, we have the Vice Chancellor, or Rector, as we say here, Kurt Rice, who is a professor renowned internationally also as a scholar. Please welcome Kurt Rice.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's such a pleasure. It's such a pleasure to see so many people here, and it's not least of all a pleasure to see so many students here. You know, at Oslo Met, we like to say that our vision is to produce knowledge that solves society's challenges, and the most important way that we do that is by sending our students with the freshest, most updated knowledge in their field out into society to do a great job for us. I have the tremendous privilege of introducing the first speaker on the program, on this fantastic program. Congratulations to those of you who have put the program together, because it looks like a wonderful, wonderful day. Anya Schiffrin is the director of the Technology, Media and Communications program at Columbia University. She is a journalist who has been all over the world doing exciting work along the way. One important book that she edited a few years ago was called Bad News: How America's Business Press Missed the Story of the Century, which was a book that got a lot of attention about the financial crisis and the relationship of the media to that crisis. She also has a new book out called African Muckraking, which is a collective of investigative journalism from Africa, written by Africans. I have to confess that in my own work in the field of gender equality, where I lead something that in Norway is called Komité for Kjønnsbalanse og Mangfold i Forskning, which is the Committee for Gender Balance and Diversity in Research, that I also had the tremendous pleasure of enjoying Dr. Schiffrin's articles a few years ago about how gender balance plays itself out at the Davos conference. And for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of reading that series of articles, I highly commend them to your review. They're important and also quite enjoyable. Without further ado, Dr. Schiffrin, it's such a pleasure to have you here. The floor is yours.
Great. Sure, I can do it like this. Okay, perfect. Everyone can hear me, yeah? Good. So thank you for having me here today. I'm one of the few people in the world who spent the last 15 years looking at African journalism and how they cover extractives. So to have a whole room of people forced to listen to me is actually very exciting. I'll try to explain why it's important and how the field has changed and how it relates really to this conference. You all know how big and powerful the extractive sector companies are, and how in the countries where they work, they wield a lot of power. Many different groups have tried to work with civil society, including obviously Publish What You Pay, EITI, and other groups, and tried to give citizens a voice in doing something about the conditions under which these huge companies operate. One pillar of this attempt to promote civil society has been journalism and investigative journalism. And so I think that's probably where Mona and Roy's interests really come together, because there's a whole lot of us who've been trying to work with journalists to help them investigate and cover many of the companies. And they've often partnered with NGOs that do that kind of work. And part of why their underlying principle is the hope that naming and shaming will actually make a difference. That if you can expose what these companies are doing, they will behave better, and government will force them to behave better. And this, of course, would be true of the Norwegian oil company, which everyone thinks of as being more careful and more shameable than, say, some small Chinese mining. So we have, I think you all know about the resource curse, but when I lecture, I sometimes like to remind people that countries that have a lot of oil or mining often have terrible conditions and very low employment rates and lots of corruption and environmental degradation. So this is just a few things to sort of point out. And then we can see here a list of some of the groups that are working on transparency and how they're working with journalists and NGOs. So we have lots of groups here on the left, many of which will be familiar to you, and probably there's even more in Norway. So Global Witness, Human Rights Watch, Oxfam, and many of them are partnering very closely with journalists. So they're giving them information, they're giving them video, they're giving them sources, they're giving them ideas, they're giving them contacts. So it's a close relationship, right? And what they're hoping is that the journalists will do the articles and then get some traction. Here's EITI, which you all know about. And I've been working for years with the Natural Resource Governance Institute. I began in about 2004 when I was sent on scoping trips to Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan to see what kinds of workshops and assistance we could give journalists in those countries. And so this is really how I came to the subject of sort of African journalism and the extractives. I've been working on it really since then. And so one of the questions that I've been asking myself lately is, to what extent are the new digital tools actually helping in this mission of helping journalists do a better job writing about the extractives and sort of exposing the problems? And, for a few years now, I've been sort of asking, are journalists in Africa and other places better able to analyze information? Are audiences getting involved? Are journalists able to make money doing these kinds of very glamorous stories? What's happening with cross-border networks of journalists, which has become a huge thing since the Panama Papers, of course? And are digital tools helping journalists find new ways of disseminating their work and helping them increase impact? And, these are all really important questions, because when I started going to Africa 15 or 20 years ago, the classic story of the classic journalist was like some woman in Ghana who was paid nothing, couldn't go out to where the mining areas were because it just wasn't allowed. If the mining company took her to the mining area, they showed her two happy workers. They didn't show her where the pollution was, where the spills had been. And then she would get back on the bus for 2 days and go back to Accra. So the journalists in Africa that were trying to write about this stuff were completely outnumbered and outstaffed. And, they were underpaid. Their bosses didn't necessarily even want them to write about this stuff. And so when digital technology came along, we all thought, this is amazing. This will transform the whole power dynamic. It will bridge the asymmetric information. All of a sudden, they'll be able to sit in Accra and they'll be able to communicate with villagers who will tell them what's going on. They'll be able to talk to journalists in London who can, bring up questions at the shareholders meeting. It's going to be transformative. And so the question we've been asking since then is, did it really make a difference? So one of the things we did in 2015 with a Mozambique co-author was we started looking around to see whether or not technology had really made a difference. And we used a bunch of case studies. We looked at the work of Angelo Azama in Uganda, the Daily Maverick, which is still going strong in South Africa, Verdade, a free weekly in Mozambique, and Rafael Marquez in Angola, very brave global muckraker who's always getting arrested. And our conclusion was, people were using digital, but really more to disseminate than to gather information. So that sort of hope that there would be all this great citizen reporting hadn't really come to pass at that point. And I want to remind you of some of the historic journalists who've written about the extractives in Africa. I don't know if any of you have read King Leopold's Ghost about the rubber in the Congo. I see someone with their hand. Well, then you'll remember E.D. Morel, who quit his job and founded a paper called the West African Mail. And all he did was expose slavery in the Congo Free State. And then Benjamin Saldanha Rocha did the same thing actually in the Amazon, where he set up a newsletter to write about the violence and the slavery perpetrated by a local rubber baron. So in my work on muckraking, I always like to remind everybody that we've had these brave global muckrakers working in the global south for well over 100 years, trying to expose evil and labor mistreatment and human trafficking, and very often that was in fact related to the extractive sector. Another example of a brave journalist who ended up being killed was Carlos Cardozo from Mozambique. Are people here familiar with him? Yeah, usually when I'm in Southern Africa, everybody knows who he is. Outside of Southern Africa, not so familiar. So remember, he worked for official media. He studied in South Africa during apartheid. He worked for official media in Mozambique, and then felt so disappointed by the corruption that he left and he started his own newsletter, Metical, which you can see, and he would fax it to people. And he began covering some of the banking scandals that were connected really to the government, and he ended up being killed. So Joel Simon from Committee to Protect Journalists, this was one of the first cases he did, investigated, was when he was sent to Mozambique to see what had happened. This is some more recent writing on Africa's extractives, and you'll notice that a lot of it is actually not written by Africans, except for Greg Marinovich's book. He was a reporter at the Daily Maverick who exposed the Marikana mining massacre, which the government was involved with. Another sort of great African muckraker is Rafael Marquez de Moraes. Everyone know him? Angola, often put in jail, writes a lot about blood diamonds and corruption in the ruling family. He's had suspended sentences, put in jail frequently, charged with defamation. So he's another sort of brave reporter who's covering this stuff. And again, social media here would absolutely help him disseminate his findings outside of Angola. It's helped him find an audience. Global Witness is another group. It's really a journalism and advocacy hybrid, based in London, mostly reporting on natural resources, and they using a lot of data reporting. And I have a list here of some of their scoops as well. So Ojo Público has been doing some tremendous reporting on gold smuggling outside of Peru, and getting a lot of attention, and again doing that sort of cross-border collaborative kind of reporting that I know you'll be talking about later, and sometimes having an impact. They're really able to kind of shame the companies. I mean, I think part of what's different about the extractive sector reporting is that these companies are so incredibly powerful that it can be really, really hard to get them to change their behavior. And in many countries, there's a lot of citizen support for these companies because they create jobs and wealth. So it can be the journalists are not only up against the companies, but they're also up against their own citizens and also their own editors. So here you have Fatal Extraction, which has been another big series of cross-border collaborative reporting. ICIJ, which did Panama Papers, worked on this, and it was really about the Australian companies in Africa. Many African journalists worked on this as well. Sahara Reporters. So these are all examples of journalists that are using digital technology to report, and more than that, disseminate stories. And none of this existed 15 years ago. So this is actually a rapid change in terms of the extractive sector, and in terms of the level of transparency that they're now able to promote. Amoyele Sowore lives in New York because it's safer, and he has recently ran for president of Nigeria as well. So he's been done a lot of big corruption stories. Daily Maverick, we already talked about as well. They've been very involved in Gupta leaks. I know that Craig is here, and he knows more about it than I do. Khadija Smilova, another muckraker who's written a lot about corruption and was sentenced to jail for 7.5 years in 2015, but escaped. So one of the things that we've talked about is, in a way, there's sort of a paradox, right? Because what we found in 2015 was the journalists had access to so much more data, so many more tools thanks to digital, and there was a chance to do much more cross-border reporting and more NGO support. But by 2015, we found that there hadn't actually been a lot more in-depth reporting. So there have been some, but not that much. And we tried to understand why in 2015 there was sort of a slump. And we realized it was a question of internal and external pressures. So the technology did not solve a lot of the old problems that journalists had always had, right? So, the fact that they were underpaid in African newsrooms meant that there weren't really journalists with enough experience to write about these very complicated subjects or to analyze the data when it was made available. It meant that they still weren't able to make real reporting trips on their own around the country to see for themselves the sort of human cost of many of this technology. It meant that they often didn't have the sort of degrees and experience to cover really complicated things like tax regimes and technical questions. And of course, to a large extent, there was a lot of self-censorship. And that partly came from all the external pressures that have been placed on, journalists in many of the extractive countries. So, a lack of data availability, and the mining companies keeping everything as secret as possible. And, I'm sure many of you have experience. Like, I tried to go do a training once in Indonesia, and we were just told by the Indonesian government, you're not allowed to go there. It's one of the U.S. mining companies that controls that area. I can't remember if it's Freeport, right, or Newport. Yeah, we called them up and said, well, would you let us go and do a training? They said, absolutely not. So, these places are walled off. They're like fortresses. You cannot go into them. It's very difficult to get there. And then there's this huge power asymmetry. So you've got one little journalist versus some big government that's making all the money off the extractives and these huge corporations. So it's actually very difficult. And the mining companies' wealth means that they can just outspend in every way, right? So they can hire lawyers to scare the journalists. They can take people on gorgeous trips. They can have fancy shareholders meetings. They can pressure and intimidate, use violence. We even found a case, Janet Radin, my colleague, alerted me to this, in Costa Rica when one of the college professors spoke out against a deal that the government was about to sign with Infinito Gold, which is a Canadian mining company. You'd think they would be Canadians, they'd be like Norwegians, they'd be nice people. The Canadian mining company sued these poor little professors for years and years and years and years. Right? They didn't win in the end, but if you're an academic without a lot of money, getting sued by a huge mining company can really, really put a chilling figure. So then there's all the sort of more subtle capture, like at Colombia, our oil program is run by people in the oil industry, right? So there's all these opportunities for sort of capture and things like that. And again, and limits on press freedom, which has obviously gotten much, much worse since Donald Trump came into power. So there's a lot of different problems. So I talk about some of these problems in my chapter, but I won't go into too much detail because it's always more interesting to hear about solutions than problems. But I will say that when the U.S. has tried to pass legislation, our oil companies have done a tremendous amount of lobbying and spending money to make sure it didn't happen or that it got repealed. And then, another point, obviously, is that journalists who are brave enough to take on these large companies and these governments end up getting beaten up or killed all the time, or at least told to I'm keeping an eye on the time here, or at least told to publish corrections. So here's some of the external pressures. Khashoggi, Jamal Khashoggi is only the most recent case. And the other thing you have to remember is when one journalist gets killed, it scares everybody. So it's a very effective thing to kill a journalist. And then here's a whole bunch of lists of corrections that newspapers in Africa have had to publish. So here's the Daily Trust had to retract a story. Independent in Uganda had to retract a story. The Citizen in Tanzania, just like almost 2 weeks ago had to retract a story. So, and actually that paper didn't just have to get retracted, it got suspended. Here's a correction about the oil company. So these are the kinds of things that happens when journalists go out and do these kinds of stories. You know, if they're lucky, they have to put a correction and retract it. If they're unlucky, they get beaten up or sued. So that really makes a difference as well. I think that, you know, what I talked after 2015, I still believe that technology could really make a difference. And I wrote an RGI, a big memo, and I said the thing to do is we just have to get the NGOs to package the data for the journalists. It's unrealistic to expect all of these underpaid journalists who don't have a lot of technical background to go and understand all this data being dumped by the oil companies or figure out what to get, what's not being dumped. It's really got to be the job of the NGOs to start doing it and packaging it and preparing it. So that was my proposal, and I had a whole lot of kind of pros and cons of why that should be done, and you know what were the risks, including say capturing the outlets and interfering with editorial independence. And we also talked about other ways that journalists who are in closed societies can leak information and get stories out even when at home things are difficult. I think that you'll be hearing more this afternoon about cross-border collaboration, but that's turned out to be a great way to get information out from places that are closed. And so is business journalism. So I have some examples of different outlets and ways we can tackle some of these internal problems. Now, I guess my point, so then what we did was we actually started going and surveying journalists about, given this difficult situation, given that you're not using tech as much as you could be, what is it that you would actually like? So these are voices from some of the journalists that we spoke to. And what a lot of them said was we still don't really understand the subject, and we, really appreciate handbooks and guidance in order to really understand the subject better. So that's what we've been, and RGI is now sort of working towards. And then, there's a constant debate about examples of impact, which is extremely hard to trace. If we do all of these things for journalists, how much does it actually help them have an impact? How much do the stories make a difference? And so we're constantly kind of thinking about all of these things. There's obviously a gray area between the no impact and the immediate impact. And how much does the training contribute? How much does working with civil society groups contribute is often very difficult for us. So in my chapter, I'm going through a lot of text pretty quickly. We have a whole list of some of the new projects and tools. And I make the point that what we've seen really in the last couple of years is that foundations like Gates and Omidyar Network, which believe in data and believe in technology, have suddenly been flooding all these countries with all these trainings in order to do this kind of reporting. So they've been paying money to places like Code for Africa and Justin Arenstein to go around the continent giving trainings to do beautiful stories about the extractive sector. And the idea of people pushing this, the donors, I interviewed them, was that this would promote innovation and it would sort of unblock the bureaucracy in many of these newsrooms and get people sort of excited to try new things. Now, nobody would tell me how much money they've spent, but it seems like it was probably something like $20 million to promote digital tools for journalists and data journalism, and a lot of which was in the extractive sector. And if any of you have been to conferences, you'll always see there's always like a training session on how to use these tools and how to use these things. And so there's been some great reporting that has resulted, and a lot of like very nice, beautiful websites with long form stories. So Chaikana would be one of them. And there's been, the pros of all this kind of reporting has been things like lots of new stories have been created, new skills are being learned, it's adding to the general amount of information that we have on the extractives. It's helping the journalists, but there's still that need to link the NGOs with the journalists. But the cons, and I'm not going to be very popular for saying so, is that I think the main problem with journalism in many of these places is the need to build audience, right? At this point, there's sort of so much investigative journalism out there. We don't really need more investigative journalism. What we do need is audiences that care and can work with NGOs to actually make something happen as a result. So teaching people all these gorgeous tools to make these beautiful visualizations is a good thing to do, but it's not clear that this has helped build audience, especially like in low-income African countries, and that it's been absorbed fully locally in these newsrooms. So in many cases, it ends up being the outsider comes to do the training. There's a beautiful story that's made. Maybe a couple of other local people sort of end up knowing how to do it, but it hasn't really sunk in. And so here you have one of the funders from Gates Foundation saying, sort of admitting, the assumption that if you build it, they will come is not working. So probably about 10 years now has been spent on these fancy, shiny new things, as we say in America, with, I would say, limited results. So, the limits to naming and shaming, I think, have become all too clear in the era of Trump. There's a lot of people that are just shameless. And so, it's simply not clear how much a lot of this reporting on the extractives is actually helping. There's definitely new tools. People definitely understand them before. I don't want to be a Luddite and say we shouldn't have done them. But clearly beautiful journalism of the kind I showed you, and you can go back and look at all of that, is out there. It's just not clear whether it has more impact than any other kind of investigative reporting, helps develop lasting audience interest or engagement, or it's going to help with the biggest problem in many of these countries and much of the world, which is actually finding funding for reporting. So that's mine. And then I have a list of useful tools and websites that people can use. So you can put that on your... So sorry to be a bit of a downer, but there we are. Americans are always downers these days.
Thank you so much to Anya Schiffrin and for this excellent presentation. And there is so much knowledge in here, as you can all hear. And I think it's important that you raise these questions because we all want to make transparency possible. And how do you do that without an audience? We have some questions and moderations, which we will have the help from Linn Anker Sørensen. She just submitted her PhD in law. It had the tentative title someday on controlling decoupling and information asymmetry and implications for modern understanding of corporate groups and intermediate control.
Luckily, it's much easier now.
So you might say she knows something about the incredible power asymmetry that Anya touched upon. So please, Anya. And Linn, over to you.
Thank you, Mona. So my background is in law, and luckily the title of my thesis is now The Multifaceted Corporate Group, Testing EU's Response to Hidden Control Structures. So I know something about how corporate groups structure their businesses in very complex ways to make laws basically inefficient. So my perspective, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And I will then bring in the law perspective. You talked a lot about the technology and how that can be used. But I'm wondering, what role can the law play in this? Because when I look at making transparency possible, there is, of course, a lot of laws that has as an outcome or as a purpose, objective, to make transparency possible. And to do that, we have disclosure as a means through reporting. And in EU, we see that we're adding more and more topics to the reporting agenda, which could also, of course, support journalists in their work. But a big problem that we see with laws is that if they are not accessible, meaning that many countries, as you also mentioned now in Africa, they have a problem with the accessibility of information because the laws are not supporting it. We have seen this in Panama Papers, other similar studies, that the problem is not necessarily that we already know that there are companies or there are maybe violence against human rights or whatever going on, but the laws are not saying that we're deeming it that is illicit. So we need to have laws that are actually supporting this. And the next thing is that the temporality of information. Because if we only have laws capturing yesterday's ways of doing business or conduct that were or represent yesterday's. As an example I use in my thesis, the use of blockchain technology as the new business model and how laws are not capturing that to a large extent. And the last thing is the processability of information. And here is where we really get to the tough stuff, both for journalists, for lawyers, for judges. It's how we actually are able, each and every one of us, to process the information that we have right in front of us. And as a good example of that, in the financial crisis, a lot of the derivatives that was part of the crash was actually based, they were transparent, they were part of a disclosure regime. So it was not the lack of information as such, it was each and every one of us ability to process that, which is often also termed bounded rationality in the language of finance. So my question to you would be, how can laws be able to support the work of investigative journalists to a better extent, to actually not only to do the work and be able to feel safe in that, but also in terms of disseminating?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously it depends very much where you are, but in low-income countries where the journalists don't have a lot of training, they won't really know what a lot of the laws are. So it'll feel really irrelevant for them, and they won't necessarily know how to get the data either. You know, there'll be a couple of journalists who will, but they will be the exception, not the rule in many places. And then the other problem, of course, is another set of laws, which is many of these countries, particularly the former British colonies, have criminal defamation and libel laws on the books. So it's so laws there are actually used to go after journalists all the time, not to protect them. So I'd say, training journalists on law can be part and is part of some of this. Is not working. Yeah, training journalists can in legal regimes can be part of this. I know at NRGI, one of the things we've struggled with is it our obligation to hire lawyers for the journalists? You know, if we start training them to do investigative journalism and then they get beaten up or sued, as the trainer, doesn't it become our moral responsibility to actually hire lawyers for them and get them legal advice? You know, another question that a lot of rights groups look at all the time is, can we get insurance for these journalists as well? Because they're doing such dangerous things. And when you're freelancing, it's really hard to get insurance. So those would certainly be some of the work that's being done. And then, of course, NRGI and other groups have been finding lawyers to help countries negotiate their contracts so that they don't get cheated when they sign their deal with the foreign investor for, you know, the oil pipeline or the diamond mining and things like that, because that happens a lot, that countries sign very bad deals.
Yeah, and a final comment before I give the question to the floor is that, as you said earlier, that we have to also look at about what is the outcome, what is the desired outcome that you want from a report. Is it just to showcase the violence against the environment or human rights that is going on, or is it actually to change again the underlying limitation, maybe in the laws or the maybe social environment or political environment? What is the outcome that you want to achieve when doing a study like this? And I think there again the law can play maybe a part, because to some extent it's also the limitations there that is making things also possible as they are.
Yeah. Have you come across any extractive sector journalism that has changed laws?
I haven't looked into extractive industries at all.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
But I know about also, or in that field, these international investment contracts that they are making, of course, and everything is covered by secrecy. So, of course, it's very difficult to also do any sort of research or journalism on it, as long as governments, of course, have an incentive themselves to keep these kind of contracts outside of the public sphere.
Yeah, I think sort of when we think about investigative journalism, and we think about impact, there's some Pryor and there's a book called By Protests on Journalism Outrage. And they argue that there's really 3 levels of impact. The first one is personal. The second one is deliberative. So journalists do some stories and then Congress or Parliament discusses it. But the sort of gold standard is legal changes. So if you can get legal changes for an investigative journalist, that is the sort of the top that you can get. But of course, tracing impact is very difficult. And a couple of my last books have really been all about that, right? When does journalism, investigative journalism, end up making a difference? And what does it take? And it pretty much always takes lots of NGOs, a moment in civil society when people are ready to hear the story and are ready to do something about it. Because all of these things that journalists do, they have been doing for hundreds of years. I mean, as you saw, writing about the extractives in Africa, something people were writing about 200 years ago, 150 years ago. But it's only sometimes that it catches fire, societies are able to do something, and then also legal regimes would become a huge part of that. Yeah. Should I take questions? Is
Yes.
any questions
Then we
out
will
there?
bring the...
So we have 2 questions. Let's take 2 first and then have a second round afterwards.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. Sorry? Yeah, my name is Maria Knovlund. I'm a staff member here and a Marie Curie scholar at Cardiff University, focusing on investigative journalism and transnationally as well. I just wonder, when you speak, you talk about journalism like it's one thing. And I just wonder if you can comment upon that, because really, when you talk about investigative journalism and NGOs and the combination, the hybrids of different types of journalism and different continents as well, could you just comment upon that, like how that differs and what that means? Because you have this American journalism, and then you got like the African, you got like, yeah.
Yes. So do you want me to take another question and answer
Just go
together?
ahead.
Yeah, my work has really been based for the last 4 or 5 years on what I call the global muckrakers. And so that was part of my attempt to sort of decolonize and de-Westernize our understanding of what muckraking is. And to really show that there were globally, including in the same time as US muckrakers, there were muckrakers in developing countries as well, in the global south. So Joel Simon might call them the vanguard journalists, a little bit similar, but I'm referring to the few journalists in each country who are willing to sort of take on power and do exposés even when it's very dangerous. And in lots and lots of societies, there's only a couple of those people and there's only a couple of those outlets. So when I sort of talk about journalists covering the extractives, that's what I'm usually talking about. And I think obviously what's changed is the cross-border collaboration popularized by ICIJ. People like Will Fitzgibbon, who did the Fatal Extraction, were working with African newspapers. Some of them are here at this conference. So I wouldn't put sort of American media in there. And broadly speaking, obviously the media is extremely polarized at this point in our country. So I wouldn't even put Fox and the New York Times in the same category anymore. They're really different beasts at this point. What's the second question?
Hi, it's Craig McEwen over here behind the pillar.
Yeah, hi Craig.
I have something I wanted to raise, and I'm battling to grasp it. I think it's something I've been battling to grasp for years. And you sparked the thought by mentioning that the gold standard in investigative journalism is changing laws.
Yeah.
And as an investigative journalist, I've often battled with the activist in me and the impartial journalist.
Yeah.
The person who wants to go out there and change laws and put bad people in jail, and the part of me that's trying to just be an impartial journalist and find information that is strategically important in the public interest and to table it in a compelling way so that citizens can use it as they wish, and they can change the laws as they wish or not. So journalist not as an activist, and I see there's a lot of blurring of that line.
Yeah.
You mentioned Global Witness. I'm now working in an organization that does climate activism, but they've got a specific investigative journalism outfit, and I find it quite hard to correlate the two worlds.
Yeah, the definition of law changing actually wasn't written by a sort of advocate journalist. It was an academic study of investigative journalism and how can we measure its impact. So that's kind of an interesting. I think that even when you're talking about, U.S. Nonpartisan journalism, there still were kind of ideas about what impact looked like, and that was in the sort of golden age before Trump and before our media got so polarized. But changing laws always was. Even the Wall Street Journal will say it takes 16 op-eds to change a law. So changing law was kind of how you measured impact. But I think obviously now the world, I think what's happened is that journalists have become desperate for money because so many outlets are closing and cutting jobs. And so they're making all these partnerships they wouldn't have made before. And inevitably, when you start getting money from a philanthropist with an agenda, that shapes your coverage. And, I've written an entire report that Craig knows about the role of Gates Foundation, which has been going around Africa and Europe, saying to media outlets, we will give you money, but only if you write about malaria, only if you write about health. And in the U.S., trying to get journalists to write articles about how great charter schools are and how great school reform is. So that's a sort of a new form of capture, which is endemic. And, all these sort of brave global muckrakers, they're trying to write about the extractives, are usually being funded by philanthropists in some way or working for sort of very patient newsrooms that allow them the freedom to do that. I feel like, having worked all over the world, when I worked in Vietnam, journalists really felt, they all worked for state-owned media, and they felt that they were working as journalists because they wanted to help better their societies. And working for state-owned media meant they could do that because they could get more information and they were closer to power. And they still felt that they were performing a productive role by exposing corruption, for example. What I found in Africa very often when I started going there, sort of 15, 20 years ago, was that journalists would say, our job, they were politicized, our job is to help the government get a better deal. We do not want a foreign oil company to come and start cheating us. So they felt that the role of the journalist and trying to support their country was not contradictory. They were able to keep those ideas in their mind very easily. And I think in the US, where from sort of 1930 to 70, maybe 80, we had this sort of ideal of this kind of neutral, nonpartisan reporter. That's died now because of Trump, and that's causing everybody a lot of pain. But that is, in fact, what's happened. So that's my overview on nonpartisanism. Okay, so I think my time's up, right? Or one more question?
We still have time for one or two more questions. I have two on the list already.
Hello. My name is Peter Skjæveland. I work in the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, NORAD. Thank you for a very interesting talk. Lena asked a question on the ultimate goal, and I was thinking if you haven't talked so much about accountability today, and I was interested to hear with you on that topic as an ultimate goal, understood as putting constraints on the use of power, and to see sort of some people write about that there is no automatic route from transparency to accountability. So have you looked into the issue of the linkages between transparency information and the accountability research? So on other accountability actors like judiciary, parliaments, the election channel, sort of.
Yeah, so this, the world that I'm in is this world of covering the extractives, and I would say that people always hope that transparency will lead to accountability, and journalists hope that reporting will lead to accountability. But what we're seeing in many, many places is it doesn't always, or it does for a short period of time. I mean, Craig can tell us more about the whole Gupta leaks and everything that happened in South Africa, but some people are held accountable and then a whole lot aren't. Or look at what's happened in Malaysia now, where the media did an incredible job of exposing the blue whale, the 1MD scandal, and changed the government, but those people aren't necessarily being put on trial. So I think one of the lessons that we're seeing from all of this stuff is unfortunately the limits the limits to transparency and the limits to accountability. And certainly in our country, we see every day that the bad guys, the crooks, the grifters, the oligarchs are all in cahoots with each other, and they're getting away with it. So, in this sad state of affairs, I think that what the journalists are doing of constantly trying to remind and constantly trying to name and shame and constantly trying to expose and promote transparency is very important work, but not always getting where we want it, getting the results that we would hope. I had a Botswanan journalist in my class last week in New York who just said, they had gone to document the president's big house that he bought for himself. And this is something journalists are doing all over the world, right? So we've seen stories like that in South Africa. We've seen stories like that in Turkey. I can think of, Philippines. And they went there into what he called the bush and immediately were stopped by 8 security guards. So then they started looking for a satellite company that would provide imagery, and they paid a few $1,000s to get these images, and they documented that the president had built himself this huge house, also with an enormous runway that could be used to smuggle ivory. And, so there they are. They've been arrested. They've spent all this money. They spent all this time. They put it out. I said, you know what? The public didn't really care that much. Probably if they had done a story about how bad the local hospital was, they probably would have gotten more attention, right? So I think there's limits to all of this, absolutely. But there's this hope that if we just keep trying, it will have an effect, and it'll do something about accountability. And it certainly can't stop. Just have to know that sometimes it's hard and doesn't get anywhere quickly.
Okay. So we have 2 last questions.
Mm-hmm.
Let's take them together, and you'll have last comment.
Hello, Louise Crawford from Newcastle University Business School.
Sure.
Hi. I'm just interested in what you were saying about building an audience that care, and also the link between transparency and accountability. And currently we're looking at the investor community and whether they're doing their job with holding companies to account.
Which community?
The investor community, the corporate investor community. So I'm just wondering if there is opportunity and potential to target investigative journalism at mobilising and motivating a response from that community rather than the extractives directly, and what your thoughts are on that.
Do you mean the investors in the companies?
Yeah, the investors in the corporate sector. If the NGOs are focusing on trying to hold countries to account and governments to account, is there opportunity for mobilising a response from the investor community who may not be particularly aware of transparency reporting that's out there?
I mean, I feel like over the years we've seen a lot of things. Like my mind immediately flashes back to when I was covering Royal Dutch Shell in the 1980s. And remember when Ken Saro-Wiwa was killed, and the investors, forcing their way into or showing up at the AGM and forcing a moment of silence, and watching Shell having to try to sort of get ahead of that. So I do feel that investors have been trying to work on a lot of these things for decades, right? And have certainly used instrumentalized journalism, where they could. And I guess more recently, we're seeing all this divestment happening as well, like many, many universities divesting from fossil fuels as well. But I don't know if there's something else you have in mind. That's
Just that opportunity and potential to mobilise that.
yeah.
It might be
Yeah, I think we can try. I mean, it's also hard though, right? Because then, a lot of it's talk, no action. But I think there have been many attempts to be made, have been made over the years. But I guess I'm skeptical sometimes. I think we have to force these companies to, pay their taxes and pay wages and not pollute. Like that's the main thing we have to get them to do, and that might just take laws. Am I out of time, or do I have a question?
So I think I'm the last question.
Okay,
Anya, hi. Richard Sambrook from Cardiff University. Anya, thanks for a really fascinating talk. Can I was struck by your comment in Vietnam, and one of the things I wonder is whether our view of muckraking and investigative journalism and the value of transparency is particularly a Western idea. When I talk to public broadcasters in parts of Asia, in China, in Iran, in other places, they say, oh no, our responsibility is social stability. It's not about holding power to account. And is that part of the issue that there is, I suppose it comes down to how do you quantify the social benefit of transparency and investigative journalism in a way where you can demonstrate in societies that culturally aren't thinking in that way, that it's worth pursuing and supporting?
So I guess again, having reviewed so much journalism from all over the world, and we're also talking, by the way, about an Asian muckraking book, which maybe you'd like to help with. I would say, certainly I'm familiar with the Asian values argument very clearly, and I've had those conversations too, but that doesn't, two things. One, there are still people that are more sort of feisty and believe in global muckraking even in those societies, but also that they view their work. That doesn't preclude a lot of the work that matters. For example, Vietnamese journalists writing about the environment or Chinese journalists writing about corruption. Like, yes, in some ways they're instrumentalized, but in another way, they really think they're making a contribution and they are doing investigative journalism. And I think Malaysia is a classic example. I mean, really, Malaysia was so repressive for so many decades, even more than Singapore. Even more than Vietnam. And now look what's happened. So part of this is actually, the internet enabling people to sort of connect and disseminate and go viral very, very quickly. So, I hope that helps. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anya Schiffrin, for this fantastic session and for sharing your knowledge on this topic. Thank you so much.